In Montreal, I'm speaking to longtime activist Abraham Weizfeld and videographer, I should mention also. Talk about your life. You said you were born to a Yiddish-speaking family in Toronto.
Yes. I have a relatively unusual life history compared to the Jewish community that arrived in Canada or the United States, prior to the Second World War, who are a community that arose mostly from Russia. After the 1880 pogroms, a large part of the Russian Jewish community emigrated to the United States and Canada. And my family remained in Poland, and my mother lived in Warsaw. My father lived in a town, a shtetl, near Lublin in the south of Poland. And when the occupation by the Nazi regime occurred in 1939, my mother escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto by way of the underground railway that my uncle had established when he himself escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto and went into the Russian forest in Russia there, on the other side of the border, or is it Lithuania? I'm not sure, but in the area that's generally known as the Pale of Settlement, which was the territory to which the Jewish people were confined to during the Tsarist regime. So this route of escape was established, and my mother did escape, and then she came back, got out, brought in some messages, from the underground to other people to tell them how and where to go, and brought out a younger sister of her own, and escaped once more, leaving the rest of her family behind, including my grandmother, who didn't want to leave to go to Russia because Poland was her home and they didn't have kosher food in Russia, supposedly. So she ended up starving to death in the Warsaw Ghetto, we heard later on.
Wow.
My father, the same thing. He escaped from the Lublin Ghetto on his own. He wasn't affiliated with the Bund like my mother was, and my uncle, so he didn't have any political connections. He was more conservative, a young Orthodox Jewish worker socialist as well, but he escaped on his own. And he told me the story of when he went to the border with Russia, and he was confronted by a soldier who said, "Where do you think you're going?" And he said, "Oh, well, he knew what to say, He said, "Oh, I've come to work." You had to say that in order to get into the Soviet Union, because if you were, a Jewish refugee, trying to escape and save your life, that wasn't good enough, You had to declare that you're coming to the Soviet Union in order to work, for the socialist fatherland. Okay. So the soldier said to him, "Yeah? Well, let me see your hands." So he showed him his hands, and his hands, were generally workers' hands, calluses and little sort of, cuts and bruises and stuff. He had one nail that had been crushed. So, authentic worker. So he was allowed to come into the Soviet Union. And but he came back into Lublin and got his younger brother out, who had been conscripted into being a Jewish policeman in the ghetto. And they made it across into Russia once again. And then, in this worker's paradise, one day he had a sore foot. He went to a doctor, and the doctor told him, "Well, if you could have come to see me, that means you could have gone to work. They're under military conscription for work. Not just for the military, but for work. The whole working class was conscripted."
This is the 40s.
Yeah, compulsory work. Yeah. So he didn't get a note from the doctor, so he went back to work the next day, and without a note, he was confronted by the head of the union, or the Soviet, or whatever they called it at that moment, which was a Jewish woman, communist, who said, "Where's your note?" "No note." Okay, so he was arrested for not showing up to work.
The day before.
Yeah. So he was put into prison. So he spent 6 months in prison, waiting for trial. And then he gets to trial, explains all this to the judge. The judge acquits him. And because he had spent the 6 months in jail, he was exempted from compulsory labor. So after that, he just traveled from city to city, selling stuff on the black market, from stuff from one city that was needed in another city, etc. This was a worker's paradise.
Now, you talked about the Bund, and I know you've studied that organization, very interested in it. Talk about that organization.
My mother was a Bundist, a serious Bundist.
What does Bund stand for?
Union.
Ah.
Jewish Workers' Union. is General Jewish Workers Union of Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. That was the full name. And my mother was a young worker and a clerk in a store, a Jewish store. This generally Jewish workers worked for Jewish employers because Jewish people were not hired by non-Jewish employers. In Poland, there was that degree of racism. So the Jewish Bund believed in Dochtheit, which means here-ness. You know, they believed that Jewish people were Polish, belonged in Poland as much as any other Polish person, and but they wanted to have the recognition of their Jewish national identity, and the Jewish Bund called for national cultural autonomy, so that they wanted to go beyond, you know, civil rights on an individual level that derived from the French Revolution, and that was Napoleon gave the Jewish people, you know, civil rights, which was after the French Revolution. Actually, the French Revolution itself did not accord the French Jewish people citizenship rights. That only came afterwards, when Napoleon needed additional support. And so my mother, you know, explained all this to me, and from a very early age. And
no, it's that they wanted a kind of national autonomy, but this is not Zionism.
No, it wasn't territorial autonomy. It was collective rights. You know, they wanted the right to have their own schools. They wanted their own language rights, as well as speaking Polish. They wanted to be able to speak Yiddish, and they wanted to have some sort of Jewish representation, their own Jewish council, so that they could have, you know, their own elected leadership, you know, on a municipal level, and things like that. You know, and the Bund, you know, was the major party in the Jewish municipal elections, more than the Zionist parties at the time. And they also wanted socialism because they wanted workers' rights. So they were allied, you know, with the Polish socialist movement as well. So when after the war they sought to get out of the Soviet Union, Poland was not, you know, hospitable. Still, there was the Kielce massacre after the revolution. Under the communist regime, there was a massacre of Jewish people who came back to the village of Kielce, about 300. And the communist regime didn't stop it, and most likely called by the Catholic Church, which is a Western Catholic Church, not the Eastern Orthodox. And so they ended up in a refugee camp in Germany. That's where my mother met my father. I was conceived in the refugee camp. And my father had a sister in Toronto, which sponsored them for immigration to Canada. And 52% of the refugees emigrated to North America. 48% couldn't get a visa to come to North America because there was still, you know, an embargo against Jewish refugees from North America on racist anti-Semitic grounds. And so 48% eventually went to Palestine. My father didn't want to go to Palestine. Why? He told me because it was a secularist regime, not Jewish in his estimation, and he didn't want to fight another war. You know, he knew that there was going to be a war.
So he was very religious.
Yes, and he was a pacifist, religious pacifist. Didn't want to go and fight against the Arabs. So came to Toronto. The first 5 years, you know, I spoke only Yiddish, you know, because at that time the Jewish refugees weren't welcome. We were called fucking DPs, displaced persons. That was the name for us, you know, by the English Anglo-Canadians. And even the Jewish Canadians, who were very Anglified, British files, who wanted to become British in a colonial sense, and they called us DP Nicks, which is, you know, little DPs. You know, we were lesser people. You know, poor, an embarrassment. We spoke Yiddish. We had an accent. You know, we weren't desired, even in our own family. So, you know, this is all I learned, you know, when I was a kid. So I learned, you know, like what politics was all about.
And you became, to move along a little, you became an anti-Zionist.
Yes, but first I became a socialist, you know, and I joined the NDP.
What does that stand for?
Oh, yes, the New Democratic Party. It's not like the Democratic Party in the United States. It's a new Democratic Party. It used the the Democratic name in order to build on its prestige of the American Democratic Party, because it was more liberal than the Republican Party in Canadians' estimation. But it was affiliated with the Second International, Socialist International, the Social Democratic International, like the Labour Party in Britain at the time was. And so this Social Democratic Party, I joined it, and I was an activist organizer in the youth movement. And then I found that the most serious people, and the ones who were most activist in the NDP, in the youth movement, were the Trotskyists. Mm-hmm. Because they were building the Vietnam anti-war movement. And the regular, Social Democrats did not want to build the Vietnam anti-war movement because that was supporting the communists of North Vietnam.
So this is late 60s, 70s?
Yeah, they fell for the whole, anti-communist, propaganda trip. Mm-hmm. And did not, wish to consider the United States in any lesser esteem, than they were sort of Americanophiles. Mm-hmm. There was a sort of, this whole, after rejecting the British colonial sort of mentality, they thought that it was more progressive to identify as Americans and with the Democratic Party. And this was the Social Democratic Party doing all this. Mm. So I started to work with the anti-war movement, which we started to build up to be a serious movement. We had demonstrations of 20,000 people in Toronto at the time in 1968. So then I respected the Trotskyists enough to join in their youth movement. And then during the big international debates, with Europe and the Mandel tendency in Europe and France and Belgium, I joined the Workers' Party in order to participate in that debate. Well, that was after. Actually, I was expelled from the Social Democratic Party because I was accused of being a Trotskyist. So I was honest with them. I said, "Yeah, sure, but I'm I and the other Trotskyists in the past have been the best builders of this party. So." Mm-hmm. What's wrong with you? Why can't you work with us? They expelled me anyway. So after that, I changed direction, and then I started to spend more time, with independent, political work. Because in 1967, with the occupation of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai and the Golan Heights, I started becoming an organizer, in an anti-occupation movement. And in 73, during the war of 73, there was a Zionist rally that had been planned, for City Hall Square. And the war broke out. So the Zionists, they were very afraid during the war because they were losing at first. And so they began to lose confidence in themselves. But they couldn't cancel their rally because it would have been, very embarrassing to do so. So they were going ahead with it. So we decided that we were going to organize a counter demonstration at the Zionist rally. So we had all the Jewish Trotskyists, the Jewish anarchists that were, well, they weren't really anarchists, they were Deutscherists. We had a Deutscherist tendency that was alongside the Trotskyist tendency.
Is it Isaac Deutscher, or is it?
Yeah.
The historian.
The historian who wrote the biography of Trotsky. But they had their own tendency, an international tendency actually. And who came from the Arbeiterring, the Jewish worker circle, they were inside that. And we all came together, 20 of us, and we put up a big banner right in front of, the Zionist rally, which said, "Not all Jews are Zionists." And before it was impermissible to say anything like that. Mm-hmm. It was like a big shock for them. And they had only about 3,000 to 5,000 people who turned out for the rally. It was a very small rally. So, and then a lot of them were actually, ex-Israeli military who had left Israel to come to live in Toronto, like great Zionists. So, and those soldiers, they started to congregate around us, trying to surround us. And the police were there trying to prevent them from surrounding us until there was more of them than there were police. And the police came and told us, "Look, we can't protect you anymore. You have to leave. We'll form a corridor here so that you can escape." They were afraid, that these Israeli fanatics, were going to attack us. Mm-hmm. And one of our members was a hemophiliac, so we had to take it very seriously. So we escaped, ran onto the streetcar, and we got away. That was our first action.
1973.
73. Then in 1976 we had a conference at which Israel Shahak came to speak from Israel, big activist there who was a scientist who produced an enormous amount of translated material which exposed the regime for what it was. And we had Mordechai Brinberg from Vancouver, and we had we also had the Palestinian ambassador who spoke, Abdullah, and I spoke. And we had 300 people who came up from the Jewish community for that. And we even had a counter demonstration of the JDL, which had 20 or 30 people demonstrating against us.
JDL, Jewish Defense League, which
Jewish
is pretty
Defense
more
League, yeah.
like a terrorist organization.
Yes, it was declared a terrorist organization in the United States for having killed the Palestinian organizer in California. And they were from Beitar, the previous incarnation of that group was Beitar. And so we had a breakthrough right there in Toronto in those early days.
Had you been over there at this time?
No.
When did you first go over?
Well, after Rochelle Corey was killed, I went to visit a Palestinian friend who lived in Nablus, who I'd met at a demonstration at the Palestinian demonstrations in Toronto. He went back to live in Palestine for a while. Nablus was the most militant Palestinian city, the most politicized city of all of Palestine in the occupied West Bank. So I went to visit him, got in contact with the International Solidarity Movement that Rochelle Corey was working with as a volunteer in Gaza. And I went and worked with them on a daily basis in the Palestinian refugee camp of Balata. And it was, Balata was under siege. The military was inside the city and was surrounding the refugee camp. And they were trying to find all the militants to arrest. And they would send armored vehicles, personnel carriers, inside the refugee camp itself, on the very market street, where all the produce vendors would go from the farms to sell their food, And that's where, the women would go to buy food to make the meals for the day. So they came in and occupied the street, and this armored personnel carrier would go up and down the street all day long, scaring people. And they wouldn't allow people to go and buy food. Everybody was inside their homes, And then the women first, the bravest, went out anyway. And they'd go outside with their hijabs,
During curfew?
No, during the day.
Oh, it wasn't a curfew.
With the armored personnel carrier there, And they'd just go out there very, head high, walk around the streets, just to show that they couldn't get away with this. They couldn't intimidate them. And then finally, the young people came out and they started to put stones on the streets so that the armored personnel carrier couldn't come into the camp easily. So what the IDF did in retaliation is they brought in the bulldozer and they dumped a whole bunch of earth and stone at the entranceway to the market street that was like 5-6 feet high. So, and you couldn't get into the street. And then they did it at the other end of the street as well. So you couldn't get out. No cars, could get in. Nobody could get in. So 10 of us from the ISM went out, and some youth joined us. We rented some shovels, went out there to dig a pathway to get over this barrier.
This is 2003.
2003. So then this Jeep is sitting there, watching us do this. So the Jeep calls another Jeep. The second Jeep comes, and they're being, watched by the first Jeep so that they're not in danger. And then the first Jeep comes, the soldiers get out of the Jeep. We're there, the Jeep is there. The soldier comes right up to us. So, we get scared, and everybody sort of, goes and hides on the side of the street. And the soldier comes right inside with his gun. And there's another soldier in the corner, with his gun pointed at us, in case we decide to attack this soldier. I have photos of this. And then he tells us, what you're doing here is illegal. And everybody's quiet, scared of their minds. So then, I stand up and I say, well, Gas Shalom says that what you are doing is illegal and you can be prosecuted,
What language did you talk?
English. These guys, they speak English, they speak in North American English. They're just, they're they're colonialists, they're colonial settlers. And so then he doesn't say anything. He picks up our shovels, which people just dropped out of fear, and steals our shovels and goes away. And he thinks that that's it, So then we go back The other Jeep is still sitting there. We go back and we get pieces of plastic and we start digging away. And we finally get lower the height of the barrier, to form pathways so the women could come in. And then things started to return to normal. So then people got courage, and the municipality hired a Palestinian bulldozer to come by and remove the barrier that had been put into place. And it worked. They didn't come back and put it back. Now there was a huge barrier on the main boulevard of the city of Nablus that had been shut off with a huge earthen barrier like this as well, right in front of the Makata, which was the headquarters of the Palestine Authority that was allowed to be established by, I think, Sharon. No, before Sharon. And Sharon came in 2001 after...
the Oslo peace.
Under Oslo, the Palestine Authority was set up and they had a headquarters there. And then Sharon provoked the first Intifada, and in retaliation he came in to repress it savagely. And he came in 2001, destroyed the headquarters, with tank shells shooting into the buildings, making huge holes. I saw all this, I have pictures. And they put this up barrier on the main boulevard in front of the Makata so that there was no traffic that could pass in the street there. And it stayed there until 2003. And I come there and say, what's that? So that's what the Zionists put there. They said, well, why don't you remove it? Oh, they're afraid to, because they'll come and retaliate, or they'll put it back, or make things worse than they were before even, So after we had the barrier removed at the Balata refugee camp, then the municipality got the courage to actually remove the main barrier. The street was opened up and was never shut down again. So we made a victory out of that year, 2003.
And how long did you stay in West Bank?
3 weeks only.
You did a lot in 3 weeks.
Yeah. Then I came back in 2011. I came back because there was a cultural center set up in Nablus that I was invited to come and work with. And this time I stayed for 3 months, which is the limit of the visa that you can obtain, from the Israeli authorities. Even though I came in from Jordan, still it was an Israel control point. To get into Palestine, you had to go through an Israel control point, which was moderately difficult, but made it without any big trouble.
Now, you've suffered professionally from all your activism. We were talking before about what you were doing in Ottawa and camping. Maybe you could talk about that just for a minute or so.
I worked in Ottawa during the first Israel invasion of Lebanon in 1982 until 1985. I worked as a political attaché writer for the Palestine Embassy, which was just called the Palestine Information Office in the Arab League. The PLO was still considered to be a terrorist organization at the time, so they couldn't have a political office of their own, and they weren't recognized with any diplomatic, status whatsoever, and so it was not considered to be an embassy. But it operated as such under the authority of the Fatah party, under Arafat's authority. And the ambassador at the time was Abdullah, and I worked as a writer there because they knew that they had to explain their position to the North American audience, and they needed somebody who could write in the North American English, and that's what I did.
But your activism wasn't, the one you got in trouble for wasn't about Palestine in particular?
No, I was also involved with the Canadian movement, and the U.S. military started to do testing of the cruise missile in Western Canada during the wintertime under Arctic conditions to test out its viability as a first strike carrier weapon to go over the North Pole to attack the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. So we were protesting against that. I started off by shouting in the gallery inside the Parliament building that was broadcast across national radio. And then we went and set up a camp on the grass in front of the Parliament building in the common lands, which used to be crown lands until the English Revolution. And so we could not be removed because it was a public park. And we stayed there for more than 2 years. And then finally...
You lived in that camp for 2 years?
Yes, I went to work in the PLO office during the day, and in the evening I went to live in the tent. I slept in the tent overnight.
In the mild Canadian winter?
Yes, I stayed there in the...
Wow.
In the second winter that we lasted there, yes. I stayed there in the wintertime, yeah. Got used to the cold, yeah.
And...
So then I finally was arrested, and I missed 3 days of work, and I got fired. But did a lot of work, and that's where I wrote a documentary study on the Sabra Shatila massacre of 114 pages.
And you had been arrested a number of times for this action?
Yes, I think about 12 times. Did some time in prison. And then again in 2008 when I went back, I was arrested during the election campaign, and they put me into prison for 3 months at that time.
For what was that?
Oh, well, at first it was because I wanted to protest. No, that was another incident. Yes, because after they had destroyed the peace camp, and I was arrested a number of times, there's so much to tell. We went back after Canada Day, and the emblem of Canada is a lion representing the British Empire and a unicorn. And the unicorn has the French Quebec province flag above it, so it represents the French side of Canada. And around the unicorn is a workhorse collar and a chain which goes down the body and symbolizes Quebec as the working class hewers of wood and carriers of water class of Canada, a second caste of Canada working class. This is what Quebec was used for by the British.
And what kind of emblem is this?
The Armorique du Canada,
Looks like the sea.
I forget what it is in English, you know, the emblem of Canada.
Wow.
So it's on the bill, on the money. And so we went up after Canada Day and with sledgehammers, and we broke the chain off the unicorn.
Wow.
You see, and for that I did 3 months in prison.
And for these actions, what is your relationship with the United States when you try to go to the United States?
Yes, well, I wasn't allowed back into the States. I wasn't allowed into the States after that because of my prison time.
Because of all these, because of that one thing, or because of all the...
Because of my whole police record, yes. That's why we're here in Montreal, you know, speaking, because I wouldn't be able to be in New York to speak with you. So then I went back to Palestine in 2011 to work with my academic colleagues. And there I was able to speak at the El Najah University, which is a huge university, 45,000 students, a majority of whom are women.
Wow. Wow.
Palestinian women students who are seeking, you know, higher education, and they're not at all submissive and cowed by religion, even though they're all wearing the hijab. 99% are wearing a hijab. You know, head covering, head shawl. Not a veil, just, you know, hair covering. And there, you know, we did a lot of work. We set up a Rochelle Corey room, computer room, with public access to the internet.
In the U.S. we call it Rachel Corey.
Yeah, Rachel Corey, yes. And there we had about 8 computers that we set up. And then we also went to to join the Palestinian demonstrations in the villages who were demonstrating against the incursions. We went to the village of Kufr Kadum, a village that was relatively isolated because the settler village, the Zionist colony next door, wouldn't allow access to the highway through the village road that went downhill directly to the highway. They shut off that route, even though the Israel Supreme Court ordered it to be opened up. The military refused to follow through the order from the Supreme Court of Israel. And so they had to go through a whole other 3 other villages in order to make a big detour, about 4 hours to get to the highway, you know, by another route. So we went down there to participate in the protest every Friday, and we were gassed. Oh, it was, you know, like very severe, you know, like not just a little bit of gas, you know, they have all sorts of equipment, you know, to shoot, you know, these gas canisters, high velocity gas canisters, this long, that thick, you know, into the demonstration. And not just over the heads, you know, of the demonstrators, at the demonstrators, you know, and then you have the rubber bullets as well. And then the first week we also went to the village of Kusra on the 23rd of September when Mahmoud Abbas was speaking at the United Nations. And that day there was a man killed at the demonstration that I was attending. And you know, I have videos of those up as well on YouTube.
Well, I'm sure we could talk a lot more, but I wanted to thank you very much. This is all very fascinating. Speaking from Montreal with Abraham Weizfeld.